to kick it off, the view, I mean, to step back, the context for this, we thought, in designing this, would be concern about energy costs and concern about energy cost increases. And to be sure, most companies we've surveyed, in fact, at least half, if not the majority in every sector, reported that they were concerned about energy costs. One of the most, well, there are different distinctions within the sample. We talked a little bit about regional distinctions, but for us, the biggest distinctions between companies and organizations when it comes to energy costs and concern, and also when it comes to who's doing a great deal on energy efficiency, critical distinctions are smaller companies, those that rent space, which are typically smaller companies, tend to be less concerned about energy costs. Those that are more concerned about energy costs, and I took it for granted that we just finished this survey, but I should make that clear. We did just complete this survey. And so we're seeing much higher levels of concern about energy from those who use fuels such as diesel, gasoline, and propane in addition to electricity and natural gas. So the more complex the consumption of energy on the part of the organization, the greater likelihood is that they are expressing concern about energy costs. And I think we know that when it comes to natural gas and propane, in Ontario at least, there was acute concern when it came to shortages this past winter. And so that's a really interesting way to consider who is more concerned about energy and why. I'll show you that just to illustrate it. First, in terms of sectorally, the top line is 67% here on a 9-point scale saying they're very concerned about energy costs as a concern for their business. And that ranges. Higher concern in the retail, accommodation, service sector, other service sectors, financial, consulting, lower levels of energy concern. Institutional, so schools, hospitals, that sort of thing, relatively higher concern as well. And industrial, trade, warehouse, around the average. Real estate, interestingly, those whose business is property ownership, not as high level of concern compared to those who are much more responsible for a range of energy costs, like I said, whether it's fleet fuels or natural gas, in addition to electricity. So there's going to be a range of concern depending on the sector, and as you're going to see, that really mirrors as well the range of activity or uptake we see when it comes to energy efficiency. Here we have cross-tabulated the total. Again, you see the 67% very concerned. But if we isolate those who said they use propane, or we isolate those who say they use gasoline and diesel or natural gas, you can see the progressively higher level of concern about energy costs in general. That's as the question was put very simply. So these are not mutually exclusive groups. Obviously, some of those who are using propane are quite likely, if not all of them, using electricity as well, so there's overlap between each of those groups. The final thing, I don't have the slide here, but when I was referring to smaller companies, one of the things that's really important is that most of these companies and organizations surveyed own at least some of the property they use for their business. They may also rent some, but again, the majority here are property owners. It's the smaller businesses that tend not to be. And so we have to think about these people in terms of the energy they use, but also if they're directly responsible for an energy bill, whether it's heating or whether it's fleet fuels. Again, the more complex their organization in terms of building stock or fleets, the more likely they are to be concerned about energy generally. But I think that's an opportunity, and I think it's a discussion for us later, even if our focus is simply around electricity. Where do we go to find people who are concerned about energy costs, and what can we do for them, regardless of what we have to offer? And to be sure, we have most people here reporting at least some energy cost increases over the last year. So basically, we see a high level of engagement in this area. And when we ask them attitudinally, we find out indeed, corresponding to that, most of these companies want to make improvements when it comes to energy efficiency. Most of them have said that energy efficiency is a priority for their business or their organization. And the clear motivation by far is to drive down energy costs. That is not a surprise, but there are very few companies who say that corporate social responsibility or environmental targets generally are a motivating factor for this. And again, to be sure, those who, well, let me show you top line. 63% here said energy efficiency was a high priority for their business. Only 12% on the far right there in green said this was a low priority for their business. And it corresponds very much to concern about energy costs, unsurprisingly. And again, it corresponds a little bit to what I showed you earlier. To what extent is improving energy efficiency a priority for your business? We have the majority here, 63% saying yes. That will vary tremendously by sector, more so than it does by region in the country. Those who rent space, far less likely to say that energy efficiency is a priority for their business, only 53%. Compared to the majority of the sample, 3/4 of whom would say that energy efficiency is a high priority. Yeah, is there a question? Can I clarify?
The previous slide,
yeah.
The architecture one, is that construction?
It's a combination of construction companies and architectural design firms. The highest priority for energy efficiency and for energy costs, though, regionally, we do see somewhat more pronounced concern and engagement in Ontario. I don't know if I've included the slide. We also see higher uptake when it comes to incentive programs or other programs in Ontario than in other provinces. It's not substantial, but it's noteworthy. The Atlantic Canadian sample is the smallest sample here, or subsample, I should say, so I'd exercise some caution. But it would appear that Atlantic Canada, with Ontario, is expressing relatively higher concern around energy costs. But we don't see something dramatically lower in British Columbia or in the Lower Mainland where, and again, this is attitudinally, I mean, the reality of temperatures and weather are what they are. But the Lower Mainland of BC had a very different winter than the rest of us. But still, this is no less relevant a topic, realistically. What would the benefits to your company be? 69% said cost savings. Environmental benefit, really only 24%, only about 1 in 4 identifying that as a primary concern for them. Now, despite the broad reach of interest in this topic, we have very few that have taken very formal steps when it comes to energy efficiency. So again, attitudinally, we ask people, where would you put yourself now practically on the following kind of scale? Are you doing all that you can, or are you doing some things and intend to do more? Only 27% believe they're doing all they can, so there's an acknowledgement that they can do much more. Most have done at least something. Most have made upfront investments of some kind, but those could be as minimal as light bulbs, switching lighting. Less than half, only 38%, have set targets for energy efficiency in their energy management. So 27%, as you can see on the top, are doing all they can. That's what they report. 56% say we have done or are doing some things and intend to do more. It's very few, only 14%, who have done nothing. Those who have done less, again, they're in their more light industrial, the service sector generally, not including retail and accommodation, but services or also the real estate sector, interestingly. Again, those who own property, and these could be small and medium property owners, not necessarily the big property owners, especially if they're developers or in construction. But as you can see, the more straightforward their business line, if they're less likely to be using gasoline or diesel or propane, if they have less complex operations, or if it's up to their tenants to control energy use, it would appear that the real estate sector is relatively less engaged in this than, say, industrial or retail and accommodation, businesses with larger footprints and with more complex operations. Only 38% have set targets for energy efficiency savings or energy cost reductions. 57% said no. Those who are more likely to have set targets in the institutional sector, which is more the public sector, which is definitely the public sector, but these could be schools, they could be quasi-arm's length agencies from government, more likely to have set targets, yet they're still among those who say there's more to be done. Industrial, Resources and manufacturing are covered in that. Again, more likely to have set targets. Those are larger organizations that may have more of the management expertise to carry that out. Now, while the minority of these companies are renters, and in the sense that they only rent space, they own no space, and we have to look at most companies as owners who have a great deal of responsibility for the building envelope that they have. It's still important to understand renters and see what may be holding them back. Most of them, 55%, in a choice that we gave them, said they do take an important role in energy use and energy efficiency, even though they only rent space. But there's still a significant percentage of renters who leave that to somebody else, 35%. And so it's, again, I think that's one of the big questions for us today, is whether we really only focus on those with more complex organizations who control the building envelope, who have greater energy costs. What do we do about the smaller companies who are also renters, who don't necessarily even have control over some of the factors that govern energy efficiency? So what's held them back? As was hinted at earlier, it's the cost of implementation. In an open-ended question here, we gave the business sample the opportunity. You tell us what's held you back. We put this question specifically to those who said they aren't doing all they can. So cost of implementation, time and human resources, lack of information, support programs, those are secondary in the mindset. And that's a big question again here. Is cost really the barrier, or do companies need to know more? But what they report is that cost of implementation or lack of time meaning money, again, those are the basic barriers to doing more. How much have you saved? We asked those who said they've done at least something. How much do you think you've saved? I'll start on the right. The most important thing is that most companies who've tried to cut down on energy use, they don't know how much they've saved. Now, they don't know how much for the purpose of a survey, and that's fine, but that's a substantial number, and it really mirrors what we saw earlier at how few people have set targets. On average, though, those who say they've made investments or taken steps to reduce energy efficiency, on average, they're saying they feel they've cut their energy bills by 9% below what they otherwise would be. Very few say they've seen zero savings. It's 8% on the far left there. The consensus is more around 8, 9, 10%. Now, the good news is, as I say, there's both engagement and at least there have been some steps taken. If they don't have energy targets, if there isn't a formal energy efficiency program, if they know they're not doing all they can, when they told us they've done something, that does include upfront investments. It's not simply turning down the lights or turning down heating and air conditioning. 79% have made upfront investments. Only 17% have not. It's the institutional sector, the public sector, that's somewhat ahead of others. 89% of institutional organizations reporting that they've made upfront investments. And then what have they done? Replaced upgraded lighting, replaced and upgraded heating and air. So those are the primary things most likely to be mentioned by companies in terms of what they've done. Building renovations at 14%, which is relatively low, again, when we come back and consider that most of these companies are building owners. Energy audits, very few, 5% have spent money on an energy audit. Now, what else has your company done that did not include upfront cost? It's the same thing. It's efficient lighting usage, efficient heat usage at 13%, and efficient lighting usage at 18%. So those are among the top pieces, but also among them in terms of something that doesn't cost, but is still important to energy efficiency, is making sure your clients and your employees are better informed. Now, what would help? So teeing off of what we heard about how cost is an obstacle, when we asked the question, what would help you to overcome obstacles to doing more, incentives or any help with costs they could get, 31% mentioning that. Government support in the form more of regulations or legislation, 13% mentioning that. Information on options or existing programs, 13%. And similar to the first mention, greater return on investment, 7%. So seeing that cost as an obstacle, if there's any help that they can get from utilities or through other programs, that's the primary mention that we're hearing. But I think that's a really important discussion to have. Is it necessarily more programs, or is it also more information to let them know about how much they can do in lieu of that? What do you think government or utilities should be doing? The next question here. Again, very specifically now, not just what would help you overcome the barrier, what would utilities and governments do? Again, it comes down to costs or incentives and assistance. Information here is secondary in terms of what's top of mind to them. But one reason why we have to have this conversation is because very few said they were familiar with programs offered by utilities and governments. Here on this slide, 13% only are very familiar with those programs, even though a higher number have actually participated in these programs. 33% somewhat familiar, about half really are not familiar with the programs that are available either to them or to industry generally. And as you can see here, higher uptake in Ontario and in BC. So low familiarity, despite the fact that 38% here say yes, they have taken advantage of a program, if not currently, then at some point in the past. But they're not necessarily familiar with what's available now. 50%, though, have not taken advantage of a program. So, in addition, though, to interest in incentives or assistance, there's a really important question about the building code and about standards. And it was a question that we put in because, of course, we wanted to understand design and construction. Across the business sample, so this is your average business, or this is a cross-section of Canadian businesses, most of whom are owners, we found that the majority, 68%, would support, that's 26% strongly support, 42% somewhat support, said they would support improved building codes that would require better energy efficiency, even if this raised the cost of commercial real estate. So this jumped out at us a little bit because formerly we were hearing that cost is a barrier. And yet, at the same time, businesses understanding that if they're going to make some investments, they'd like to see it made across the board. And that can be done with standards. Right now, let me just jump ahead and show you the actual thing. In terms of where the marketplace is going, designers and builders, construction companies, many of them have been involved in either BOMA Best certified projects or LEED certified projects. 63% of architects have been involved in that kind of green certified design. 42% of construction companies. And when we asked builders and designers, do you see a growth market in this area, the answer is yes. 59% of architects believe there will be increased demand for green certified projects of the kind just mentioned, BOMA Best or LEED, for example. 41% of construction companies. So a substantial number across the building sector expects that to be a growth market. 3 and 4 architects would be interested in being in those sorts of projects. Almost half of construction companies would be interested in being involved in those sorts of projects. But something that holds them back, question again here specifically to those in construction, how likely would you be to be involved in that sort of design? So even though most feel this is a growth market, 57% agreed that they would be unlikely to design or build more energy efficient space until it was required by more stringent building codes. So this is an interesting twist, that most people see a growth market here, but most in the design and construction sector see it as a growth market for a niche in their industry. And that as long as upfront costs are a bit of a barrier, to say the least, or client preferences, Again, it comes back to the question of building codes. And it helps to explain why, again, not simply in the business sample, but in the construction and design sample, we have support. Again, same question, but with the building sample. The vast majority of architects would support more stringent building codes for greater energy efficiency, even if it raised the cost of commercial real estate, but even a majority of those in the building sector, 67% of construction companies, 26% strongly support, plus 41% somewhat support.